It's time now for today's press review. For that, I'm joined in the studio by Erin Ogunkeye once again. Now, French President Emmanuel Macron is in Jordan today, a day after visiting Israel, to meet with Israeli leaders, also Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority. Macron on Tuesday making some comments that sparked widespread surprise, Erin.
Yeah, that's right, Haxi. Libération this morning on its front page describes Macron's proposal of an international coalition to fight Hamas, similar to the one that's fighting the Islamic State group, as strange. The paper wonders if it's realistic at all to have the same international mobilization that we saw against the Islamic State group, which of course was a global jihad movement that committed attacks in all corners of the world, really, for Hamas, and also wonders what countries in the region would be willing to participate in the destruction of Gaza with the risk of even more civilian victims. Now, Le Figaro has a rather harsh criticism this morning. It asks whether or not Aladdin Macron plunged into his mirage of the East as soon as his flying carpet landed in the Holy Land, when General Macron realized that he cannot single-handedly decide the actions of more than a dozen militaries, the paper writes. His entourage was eventually forced to clarify that he only meant that we should see how parts of that coalition can be applied to Hamas. In other words, at least concludes Le Figaro, this idea is not going to go very far. And I'll finish with Humanité. Unfortunately, I don't have the graphic here, but basically the paper described Macron's visit as a missed opportunity in the Middle East. The paper saying that Paris's total alignment with Israel kind of annihilated Macron's claims to want to initiate a sustainable, real new peace process. The piece arguing that he isn't taking into account the rising anger from Gazans, and that's led him to propose ideas that are essentially in total contradiction with his purported aim of pushing for a two-state solution.
And Erin, staying with the Israel-Hamas war, one of the released elderly hostages spoke to the Israeli and international press on Tuesday. Her comments, the source of quite a bit of debate this Wednesday.
Yeah, that's right, Haxi. The Times of Israel tells us that 85-year-old Yocheved Lifshitz was one of two elderly female hostages to be released on Monday, and she participated in a press conference on Tuesday. And she said that she went through hell. She was beaten on her way to Gaza, forced to navigate these kind of wet, dark tunnels underground. But she also said that her captors eventually treated her well, that they had access to doctors, medicine, the same meals that her captors were eating, and essentially that many of her needs were met. Now, the conservative Israeli media outlet Ynet describes this as kind of a public relations catastrophe. He said it's a blunderous move for Israel's public diplomacy in that it humanized a terrorist organization. The piece specifies that it's not blaming Lifshitz for this, but the editorialist does call on Israeli officials to kind of issue explicit directives regarding communication with Israeli captives if and when they are released in order to prevent future public relations disasters, at least as Ynet sees it.
And in the press also pointing out that there are very important details regarding her specific situation that could be affecting or at least influencing her comments.
Yeah, that's what the gist of this piece by the Jerusalem Post, which wonders how much Hamas's psychological warfare indeed impacted her comments. Not only the fact that she, of course, witnessed the murder of her neighbors before she and her husband were eventually kidnapped, but also the fact that her husband is still being held hostage in the Gaza Strip. Now, arguing that there are things that perhaps everyone can learn from her testimony, the Israeli paper Haaretz suggests that her comments maybe aren't necessarily a surprise, given the fact that the Lifshitz couple were well-known peace activists, according to their daughter. They advocated for Bedouin rights. They reportedly met with Yasser Arafat, and they had joined coexistence organizations that fostered ties with Gazans. The article argues then that we should not judge her reaction, the way that she processes what she's been through. But the piece says that we can marvel at what seems to be her superhuman empathy. They conclude that she's not proving that Hamas is humane in what she said, but instead proving that she herself is humane.
And Erin, there's also been an upsurge in violence elsewhere in the region since the 7th of October massacre by Hamas militants.
Yeah, Time magazine reminds us that the war has in some ways reached other Palestinian territories. Some 95 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank since October 7th, mostly by the Israeli military. That makes it the bloodiest period there in about 15 years. Israeli rights group B'Tselem says that these deaths have also come with new restrictions on Palestinian movement across the West Bank, and also an uptick in settler violence, Israeli settler violence, targeting Palestinians. Today's edition of The Guardian, meanwhile, has a big spread on some of that violence that we're seeing in the West Bank. It quotes a resident that says that Israelis have been coming to the Aqaba Jabir refugee camp in the West Bank every day since October 7th. He says he feels like they're not even making arrests anymore. He says that he thinks they've come to kill instead. They want revenge. The piece also points out kind of the difficult political situation for the West Bank. It says that the ruling Palestinian Authority is unpopular, seen as undemocratic because it's not held elections in 16 years. But there's also no alternative. This piece also reminds us that Hamas has active cells across the West Bank and some degree of popular support there as well.
And Erin, you're finishing with the death of one of the first African-American action movie stars.
Yeah, that's right, Haxie. The New York Times has a big spread on him this morning. That's Richard Roundtree, the actor who passed away of pancreatic cancer at the age of 81. Now, his best-known role was in the movie Shaft, which was one of the first so-called blaxploitation movies, which essentially tried to appeal to urban African Americans by simply casting black actors. The New York Times says his role in that film essentially kind of redefined African American masculinity in cinema because, in the actor's own words, he was a black man who, for once, was a winner. It was also the first time that a movie showed a black man leading a life that was far from racial torment. He had another story to tell. So I think we can finish with a clip from the movie Shaft, Taxi. That's all for today's press review, Haxie.
Thanks a lot, Erin. Ending there with the news of the death of Richard Roundtree, the African-American movie star who's died at the age of 81. Well, that's all we have time for right now. Thank you for watching. Do stay tuned in. More world news coming up in just a few minutes' time here on France 24.